Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and on this channel I do reviews of both movies and music along with the occasional commentary piece. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then please feel free to give this video a like and to subscribe to my channel to see more future content. And today we have a new episode of The Critical Corner, my reoccurring series on my channel. If you are new to this channel, first of all, welcome, but secondly, The Critical Corner is a series on my channel where I break down my thoughts in shorter form on either all music or all movies. And today's episode is going to be focused on all movies. I've seen a lot of movies lately, and of course, if you hadn't noticed, I took a bit of a break from YouTube, so I do have a lot to talk about, and I think I have a really interesting set of movies to discuss today. So, let's go ahead and get started with our first movie. Alright, first off, we have the movie Malignant, and this has become one of my most anticipated movies of the year when I first heard about it, mainly because I heard that James Wan was going to be directing it. James Wan is by far one of my favorite horror directors out there, if not my absolute favorite. I think this guy is really dedicated to his craft, and what he does, some people won't always enjoy, but I always respect when he comes up to the forefront to direct horror movies. Of course, he's most known for probably Saw, Insidious, and The Conjuring, all of which are excellent movies. And in this movie, we see main character Madison being terrorized by seemingly sleep paralysis, or at least that's what it seems to be like in the movie at first, as she watches this person, this entity, this demon, seemingly, killing people right in front of her, and there's nothing she can do as she watches people die. But eventually we realize that these people are also dying in real life, seemingly at the hands of this creature that Madison can see. And so the question is, who is this creature, and why is Madison the only one who seems to be able to have visions about him? Now, one thing I'm going to say about this movie is that I think you should go in with completely no expectations. I think you should go in completely blind. I only saw one trailer for this movie, a very short one at that, so I didn't know much about what this movie was going to offer. And I think that made my experience a lot more fun. I think you should also go in without hearing other people's opinions, because this movie has definitely been the subject of controversy. There's been a lot of talk about it, a lot of people who seem to absolutely love this, and a lot of people who seem to absolutely hate it. First of all, welcome back to the horror landscape, James Wan. It is good to have you here once again, and in fine form. Even though I wouldn't call this one of James Wan's better movies, in fact, it might be lower on the tier for him, but even for a lower tier movie of James Wan, a lower tier horror movie, this one is still really good, and I think it still does a lot of really cool things. First of all, I think the delivery of scares here is very well done, and in fact, I would call this a synthesis of all of James Wan's previous horror films. There's a little bit of Saw in here with the extreme violence, some of the most extreme violence I've ever seen James Wan do. There's a little bit of Insidious in here. There's a lot of scenes that feel pulled straight out of the Insidious book, and there's even some Conjuring moments in here too. I think for that reason, this movie has a very unique identity to it with combining all these things. Because sometimes it feels like a straight up psychological horror movie, and then sometimes it feels like a straight up crazy insane action horror movie. I also think there's a sort of interesting mystery element to this movie as you're trying to figure out who this entity is that main character Madison keeps on seeing. Now, there's a lot of guesses you can make, and maybe even by the end you'll have sort of an idea of who it is, but I don't think you'll guess what the actual reveal is, because I certainly wasn't expecting it. It's a pretty insane reveal that changes the course of the movie in a split second, and I think that's for a good reason. It's crazy over the top, and that's how the second movie becomes, the second part of this movie. It becomes crazy over the top, almost like a B movie, and I say that as a compliment. Performance-wise, I won't say we get any knockout of the park performances here like we do in a movie like The Conjuring or The Conjuring 2, but I did still enjoy what the main actors had to offer. I thought Annabelle Wallis as Madison did a really good job. She played it subtly when she was meant to, and she played it over the top when she was meant to. I also thought that Maddie Hassan as Sydney Lake, her sister, was really good in this, and I think the chemistry between the two of them was great. The cops are also pretty solid in this movie, but I think it's those main two that are really the appeal of this movie more than anything else. I will say that as a whole, the performances are probably the weakest aspect of this movie. Like I said, they're not bad, but they are probably one of the weaker moments. Also, I will say that even though I do love the shift that this movie goes through, it does come at you very fast, and it can be a little hard to adjust to at first. But once you get into that flow of that adjustment, I think it's just easy to sit back and have fun with this movie. The other main problem is that I think, even though I do like the scares of the first half of the movie pretty well, it can become a little repetitive. I feel like James Wan doesn't vary up the scares as much in the first half as he could have. Nevertheless, Malignant is incredibly fun, and it is a really solid horror movie. Like I said, it's not one of James Wan's best. It's not going to give you those spine-tingling scares that I feel like the Conjuring movies do, or even the same sense of tension that a movie like Saw can give you, or even the same type of creativity as Insidious, but I feel like it does have its own unique identity, with being a synthesis of all of James Wan's previous products, while still having some dedications to old slasher movies and old gore movies that are clearly intentional. For that reason, I'm going to give this movie a solid 4 out of 5 stars. Definitely one of my favorite horror movies of the year. Okay, I really don't want to talk about this movie, but at the same time, I sort of do, because this is just a fever dream of a musical. Just, oh my gosh, probably the worst movie I've seen this year. I'm just going to get that out of the way. This is the worst movie I've seen of this year, easily, by a landslide. There's another movie I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes that is pretty bad as well, but I think this movie is sort of in a league of its own in terms of its quality. I'm of course talking about the infamous 2021 Cinderella Remake, something that's already been made fun to death on social media, especially places like TikTok, and deservedly so, because this movie is awful. Now, something I always make as a rule, general rule at least, for remakes, is I feel like they should have their own unique identity while still staying somewhat true to the morals and the things that the original has to offer. But honestly, and I can't believe I'm saying this, I would take Beauty and the Beast remake or the Lion King remake any day of the week over what this Cinderella reinterpretation offers. This is embarrassing, is what I'm gonna say. It's almost so bad it's good, but there's so many moments in here that are just utterly painful that I can't really call it that. This is a hard watch to get through. First of all, the choreography in this. That was the first thing, more than anything else, that stood out as just horrible to me. The dance numbers in this movie are just awful. The opening number in particular has some of the most questionable choreography choices I've seen in any musical to movie adaptation ever. And then we get into the music. And man, this movie decides to be a jukebox musical for some reason. And by jukebox musical, I mean pretty much every song here is a cover, save for a couple of originals. And it's not like the cover choices are necessarily wrong, it's just that they're really stupid in my opinion, and I think they take away from the time period that this is supposed to be taking place in. It is serious tonal whiplash to see all these people dressed in this medieval time period costuming, and then to hear them singing Perfect by Ed Sheeran or Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes, which was truly a perplexing choice, and it was delivered so badly. Truly an insult to the great original song. I did not care for the music in this as a whole. The cover song, or rather not the cover song, but the original song, A Million to One, was okay, but it got repeated so many times that it started becoming old very quickly. Plus, I feel like most of the people in here were average singers at best, or did not know how to perform in a Broadway style. The not performing in a Broadway style was especially true for Camila Cabello, who was a very perplexing choice to choose as Cinderella. Her performance was shallow, empty, and pretty much non-existent. You could have replaced her with anyone else, and we would have gotten about the same thing, but at the same time, Camila Cabello makes some disastrous acting decisions here that are just incredible to watch on screen. Also, weirdly, it seems like she can't harmonize with herself, or the audio mixer of this movie just really insulted her, because there were some parts where she just sounded awful, and it feels like maybe they should have just said, hey, let's do this take again, and the acting doesn't fare much better either. I feel like everybody here is pretty bad, with the exception of Idina Menzel, who honestly shouldn't have been in this movie at all, because she's far too talented for this Drek. Same goes for Minnie Driver. Pierce Brosnan is at least having some fun with his role, but he's so over the top still that I can't help but just dislike his performance overall. Also, like some of the Disney remakes try to do, even though this isn't a Disney movie, it still has that same problem of trying to modernize the story, and I feel like the original story was fine enough. Now, Cinderella is not necessarily one of my favorite fairy tales out there. I've never necessarily loved it, and I think it does deserve more scrutiny than other fairy tales out there. But at the same time, the way this movie does it is just so knock over your head obvious that it becomes very cringeworthy. I feel like when you're wanting to have some political messages in your movie, you need to do it well, and you need to do it in a way that will connect to the audience, and everybody's just been making fun of it because of just how it feels like an after-school special more than something that's delivering any type of legitimately good message. This movie is awful. Truly one of the worst fairy tale updates I've ever seen, trying to be modern and time period-like at the same time, trying to have modern music in a place where it just doesn't fit, and having actors who just don't know how to act, or people who shouldn't be acting in the first place. Camila Cabello should not have been in this movie, in my opinion. She really just delivers one of the worst performances I've seen this year. For that reason, I'm ranking this a half star out of 5. Yeah, I really didn't like this movie, and I do not recommend it. Thankfully, we now move on to a much better movie in The Green Knight, directed by David Lowry. And this movie is, of course, once again taking a sort of ancient tale and updating it for the modern times. But unlike Cinderella, this one actually does a good job at retelling this story for a more modern audience. And it still very much so feels like a period piece to me. There's still a lot of ancient language used in here, and it feels distinctly of its time, while definitely having some things that make it feel like it very much so belongs in this modern era. This is, of course, based on the story Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a very bizarre tale that I think is a little hard to adapt, but this movie did a really good job at it, and created a product that is very unique. The fact that this movie doesn't spoon-feed you with its message and instead subtly reveals its layers, especially with its main character, is really what makes this movie endlessly interesting to watch. We see Gawain, played by Dev Patel, go through many different tests as he's essentially trying to prove his honor. And the way they are building up this character development is endlessly compelling to me. I really liked following along with this character and his journey, and that's mainly due to Dev Patel's absolutely magnificent performance. This is probably one of the best performances I've seen this year by far. He just really does a good job at showing the almost ignorance of this character and sort of the innocence of this character too, as he hasn't really gotten to see much of the world at large, and that we get to see him become more and more disillusioned as he sees what the world is really like. And also, it is one of the most beautiful films I've seen this year by far. Probably the most beautiful. Just the cinematography here is off the charts. There are some gorgeous shots here, and it just makes the movie feel wonderfully of its time. You feel like you're transported into this medieval period with how detailed everything is. From the costuming, to the lighting, to the way that the buildings of the world are filmed, and everything like that. It is just a gorgeous movie. The main thing I will say about this movie is that it is very weird. This movie dedicates to its weirdness too. There's a lot of scenes here that my mouth was left hanging open just by how crazy it got, and by how dedicated it was to that. And it never goes too over the top with it. It keeps it appropriate for the placement it's supposed to be in, but it is still pretty bizarre. And there's some places that'll leave you thinking and wondering what they were trying to do with certain scenes. And I say that, once again, as a compliment. It leaves you thinking about the movie long after it's gone. And the ending of this movie, man, talk about an impactful ending. I don't want to reveal what happens in the end, but when Gowan inevitably faces against the Green Knight, there's some incredible stuff that happens here. There's a section here that is almost entirely silent. No dialogue, just watching Dev Patel and Gowan and what he's experiencing. And the no dialogue and just the beautiful score creates something that is incredibly impactful. David Lowry did great with this film, and it is something that I feel like will be talked about for all year pretty much. It is a controversial film, and I think that it is for a certain type of audience, but this was right up my alley. 4.5 out of 5 stars for me. Next up, I'm going to be talking about the remake, or more like the sequel to The Suicide Squad. I call it more of a remake because it feels like James Gunn here rebooted The Suicide Squad after the original movie that not many people enjoyed. Even though the original movie was really successful and was a pretty big moneymaker for DC, it was not a critical or audience success. People did not enjoy that one. And I can say that I'm in that wheelhouse as well. In fact, I would say that The Suicide Squad, the original one, is probably my least favorite superhero movie I've ever seen, if not one of my least favorites. I think it is the worst, personally. I mean, there are some more cringy ones out there, I suppose, like Catwoman or Daredevil, but this one was just more painful than anything else. It was just incredibly dull in places, the action was badly filmed, the performances were mostly uninteresting with the exception of Margot Robbie, and the music choices were just utterly perplexing. It's interesting because the original Suicide Squad felt like it was trying to be a James Gunn movie, copying off Guardians of the Galaxy very noticeably, but it didn't have any of the heart or any of the smart reasoning for its musical choices that the Guardians movies had. So it only made sense to me that DC would recruit James Gunn for the remake of The Suicide Squad. And man, does this movie work. James Gunn proves himself to be a great director once again, and proves that he knows how to make a good superhero movie that doesn't take itself too seriously, while at the same time still having good characters and some excellent action sequences and some excellent music choices. I love that James Gunn created his main character basically completely anew for Idris Elba himself. And because of that, this character does feel fresh and original, and Idris Elba absolutely owns the role. He gives an excellent performance here, and it is very fun to follow along with him as essentially the main character of this series. I really liked watching him, and his character development was really well done. It felt like an update of Deadshot, of Will Smith's Deadshot, and I think purposefully so, because his character is named Bloodsport, which does sound similar to Deadshot, but his character development is just so much better. Margot Robbie comes back as Harley Quinn, which was, of course, a smart decision, and, of course, inevitable because everyone liked Harley Quinn, for the most part, in the original Suicide Squad, and she's even better here. I think she has a much better character arc, and I think they treat her character a lot better here, whereas they were more objectifying her in the first Suicide Squad. In this one, they give her some actual stuff to do, and they make her a much more menacing character to deal with. I think they make her an actual good villain, or good anti-hero almost, and that makes her a lot more interesting. Colonel Rick Flag is a lot better here, having a much better character arc, especially in his questioning of his own patriotism, and John Cena as Peacemaker is awesome. He gave probably the funniest performance here. And of course, we have to talk about Sylvester Stallone as King Shark. I mean, talk about just a wonderfully fun performance. This was the Groot of this series, except I might even like this character a little better than Groot because he was just so endlessly funny and endlessly delightful to watch. Daniela Melchior as Ratcatcher 2, sorry if I said that name wrong, is the heart of this movie, and I really liked her character as well. I would say all the main characters here are great. Polka Dot Man is excellent as well, having a really intriguing character to deal with there, very interesting. So James Gunn just did a great job with all his characters and making them have good chemistry together and having them work out their conflicts together and making them realistically anti-hero-like. I think this was just a really fun superhero movie and by far one of DC's best. 4 out of 5 stars for me. Next, we have the remake of Candyman. Now, I have seen the original 1992 one. In fact, I saw that one pretty recently, and I have to say, I'm surprised this one isn't talked about as much as some other horror movies. I put it right up there with some of the best horror classics. It may not be as good as movies like Halloween or Alien, but it is a really solid horror movie, and I think it deserves more conversation, especially in its commentary on race and mixed with horror. It almost feels like an early inspiration for Get Out, and in fact, Jordan Peele was part of the writing team for the remake of Candyman, so it wouldn't be surprising to me if Candyman inspired him when he made Get Out, because there's a lot of similar elements between the two, I feel like. And like the original Candyman, this remake is once again a commentary on race and on gentrification. The only unfortunate thing is, I feel like this one just isn't as compelling in delivering those messages as the original Candyman was. In fact, this one was a little bit disappointing to me. First off, I feel like it took a little too long to really get started. There's a lot of weird commentary in here in the first part about art and about what constitutes art and about the limitations of art, especially modern art, and to be honest, that just didn't really vibe with me that much. I think when you're talking about modern art, I'm sorry, I'm just not a big fan of modern art. I get that there's different ways to do art these days, and we have a lot more abilities to do it, and we're a lot more open-minded about what can be art and what can't be. But this movie just really tries to say some things that it thinks are compelling, but I really don't think they are. When we finally did get to the horror elements of this film, it actually worked decently well. There were some cool delivery of scares in here. There was this elevator scene in particular that I really enjoyed and I thought was a really good payoff. The performances in this movie are pretty solid as well. Yahya Abdul-Mateen is great as the main character. I thought he was by far the strongest element of this movie. I just wish that he had been given a little bit more to deal with, because what he has here isn't as interesting as it could be, in my opinion. I also think probably the biggest issue with this movie is that it changes the lore around the Candyman a little bit. Not his main lore, that you have to say his name into a mirror 5 times and he appears to you when you say that. The lore comes more around what he's supposed to represent. And I understand why they changed it. They're trying to make it more relevant for the modern times. But at the same time, I'm not sure if the change works, because I think it actually makes Candyman a less sympathetic character when I think they were trying to make him more sympathetic. Overall, this movie is a bit of a mixed bag for me. There's some really good elements. I think the scares are really well done, and I think the performances are good, but there's also some elements that I don't think work. Mainly the reinterpretation of the lore of Candyman, and also the commentary on modern art is just not that interesting to me. 2.5 out of 5 stars for me. I really wish I'd liked this one more. The animations in this of the original movie and them using like stick figures and shadowy figures and stuff was pretty cool, at least. But I just wish there had been a little more substance to this movie, because it felt like a lot more style. So I said we were also going to be talking about another movie that was almost as bad as Cinderella, but not quite as bad. And here we go. I'm sure you could probably guess what movie it was going to be. Of course, it's the Netflix original He's All That, which is the remake of She's All That. I rolled my eyes several times when I saw the trailer for this movie, and I rolled my eyes even more and just exasperatedly sighed when I saw that TikTok star Addison Rae was going to be the star of this movie. And I don't know, it's a bit of a mixed bag to have someone like Addison Rae in this movie, because there are some really funny moments in here that are just horrible acting that almost reach the so bad it's good range. But there's also some moments where her performance is just too boring to even care. What surprised me the most was that her performance wasn't actually terrible. It was just so mediocre that it was utterly forgettable. And you'd think she could give a better performance in that she's basically playing herself, because she's a social media influencer in this, but she really just doesn't do anything memorable with her role overall. Now, on the other hand, you have a talented actor like Tanner Buchanan in this, who I really enjoy in Cobra Kai. And in fact, there's an almost clever moment in this movie where they're referencing that show where Tanner's beating someone up. And it's almost like a spark of creativity in this movie, but then that spark is gone as soon as it came, which makes it all the more perplexing why they couldn't have had more moments like that in this movie. It just makes this a very fascinatingly bad movie to me. There are some moments that I weirdly enjoy in this movie for how bad they are. It's just a weird movie of contradictions, because there's some parts where it's just too boring to care, but then there's some parts where it's just incredible how bad it gets. Like this dance scene at the end of the movie where it's trying to be very TikTok-y with its dances and stuff. It's so utterly bad, I was just laughing out loud. It was just horrible. But then there's just these boring parts where it feels like a generic rom-com, like every Hallmark rom-com ever. It's just a weird mixed bag of sorts, and it almost makes me wonder what the people were thinking when making this movie. Were they trying to make it intentionally cringy, or were they actually trying to make something interesting? It just doesn't seem like there's an answer to me. Still, this movie is undeniably bad. It's one of the worst movies of the year, even with how fascinated I am by it and how it's split into these boring and then terrible parts. 1 out of 5 stars still at the end of the day. I really actually do recommend this one just so you can see the crazy stuff that happens in this and just how fascinatingly weird it is. And finally, we end off with a film that I unfortunately don't have too much to say about. I had some high hopes for Reminiscence, especially when I saw that it was directed by one of the creators of Westworld. Lisa Joy is a pretty talented creator. I think Westworld is a pretty solid show, even if it isn't as good in its later seasons as it was in its first. But unfortunately, this movie takes the least compelling ideas about Westworld and waters them down even more. This movie is all about Hugh Jackman's character Nick Bannister trying to go through his memories, trying to figure out if his wife or his girlfriend, I don't remember which one she really was to him, I think more like girlfriend/lover, May was really who she said she was. And there are some interesting aspects to that, in him being so attached to the past that he becomes obsessed with it like a drug. There's some interesting commentary on that in the film, but the way they use this technology where he's able to go into the past really creates almost a disconnect with his character. You don't really get to know him very well. And because of this, it's hard to attach onto this movie because you're just watching this character live vicariously in another world. If there had been a more interesting way that they had done this, I suppose it would have worked, but it just really didn't, and it didn't create much interesting to talk about at the end of the day. Also, the line deliveries in this movie and the dialogue that was written doesn't feel like something a real human being would say, at least in my opinion. It's all very pretentious dialogue that, ultimately, when you think about it too much, doesn't have much to say beyond what shows like Black Mirror and even Westworld itself have said far better. For that reason, I'm going to give this movie a 2 out of 5 stars. Like I said, there's not much to say about it. It's just a very mediocre movie, even though Hugh Jackman and Rebecca Ferguson give pretty good performances. So yeah, that was my thoughts on all those movies for this episode of The Critical Corner. What were your thoughts on any of the movies I talked about? Let me know in the comments below. Once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then I once again ask that you give this video a like, and subscribe to my channel to see future content. But until then, I will see you all in the next video.